Well, thank you for the devotional this morning. I suppose I thought how important the family was, but working on these messages, it has come through to me more than ever before how crucial the family is. This morning we had the importance of fathers pointed out. It cannot be overstressed. It is very important. And then in our children's story, we had parentless boys. And studies have been done as to what happens in a country that have that. Well, our first message on this subject of divorce and remarriage, which I didn't want to preach on again, was the sin of divorce and remarriage. It is a sin. It is a huge sin. We have looked at the major scriptures such as Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4, Matthew 19, 1 Corinthians 7. We briefly went through the clear passages and gave the hermeneutical rule that the unclear must give way to the clear. I believe the view we presented gave a consistent view of what the Old Testament taught and the New Testament. And if you want to put together the Old Testament and the New Testament in their views, you have a major task on your hands. So having looked at the biblical factors involved, we want to look at some of the historical factors. We will look briefly at the time of the Old Testament and the New Testament, and then spend most of the time in the church age. And you will understand that we will be speeding again this morning, but not just because I have a lot of material to cover, but rather we have a lot of history to cover. Too much. We begin with the Old Testament. History has not been a great focus in my years of study, but it seems clear that liberal and conservative viewpoints on different issues have always existed. And I think that there are not two viewpoints of life, liberal and conservative, but three. There is the liberal viewpoint, the conservative viewpoint, and the right viewpoint, the biblical viewpoint. There may be times when the liberals are right on some point or other, maybe, but I expect if either of those is right, it is more often than not the conservative. But the conservative's view is not necessarily always right either. When one comes to such matters as divorce and remarriage, we are dealing with the most precious of human relationships. How one views such a subject has a lot to do with whether one is a humanist or a theist. Let me explain. A humanist sees life from man's perspective. When you look at our subject from man's perspective, there is no question but that we believe for man's best good, we must allow for both divorce and remarriage. Study the internet, you'll find it. A theist sees life from God's perspective. When you see life from God's perspective, it is not that which is in man's best interest from man's point of view that is most important, but that which is for man's best good from God's perspective. When we live according to the dictates of our human sympathies, we can easily become destroyers of the world. I am convinced that no one has come to the view that divorce and remarriage is acceptable to God from an objective study of the Word of God alone. Certainly the vast majority have bowed to the pressure of divorce and remarriage because of pressures within the family. I have watched this in those who were determined not to bow to that pressure, and when it came in their family, they caved in. And once it hits so close, and one now begins to study God's Word to see what it says, guess what one finds in the Bible? It's okay. It says in one or two, here's how we start off. It's okay in one circumstance or two. The law is it'll never stay there. So the law of divorce and remarriage kicks in, and then it is another and another and another, and there is no end to the anothers. when it enters society until you have no-fault divorce. I think that everyone who allows divorce and remarriage for one reason or more reasons contributes to the downfall of human society. Every last person. Well, by the time Christ was born, Judaism had basically divided into liberal and conservative views on the divorce subject. Rabbi Hillel was the champion of the liberal school. The dates given for Rabbi Hillel are 110 BC to 10 AD, so he died shortly after Christ was born. This would make him around 120 years old when he died. That's probably a little stretched, but his death at 10 AD is probably more likely. Rabbi Hillel was a very influential rabbi. The Jewish Encyclopedia says in the 1st century BCE, Babylonian-born Hillel, later known as Hillel the Elder, migrated to the land of Israel to study and worked as a woodcutter, eventually becoming the most influential force in Jewish life. Hillel is said to have lived in such great poverty that he was sometimes unable to pay admission fee to study Torah. And because of him, that fee was abolished. He was known, listen, he was known for his kindness, gentleness, and concern for humanity. Now, that which is interpreted by mankind as kindness, gentleness, and concern for humanity wants to bring about what we call a humanist. A humanist centers his views around that which he thinks is good for mankind. Anyone who considers human relationships and wants to do what looks as if it would be the best for humans will always be permissive and allow for divorce and remarriage. It will never change. And that is the view of Hillel. In brief, he allowed divorce for almost anything. Someone said if a wife burned toast, you could divorce her. A friendly opponent to Rabbi Hillel was Rabbi Shammai. He lived from 50 BC to 30 AD, so he died probably just about the time Christ died. As an opponent to Hillel, of course, he was more conservative. He came to the conclusion that only for marital unfaithfulness could divorce be granted. In Judaism at the time of Christ, as in our day, liberalism prevailed. As I pondered this, I could not help asking, could it be that divorce and remarriage was the downfall of Judaism? When we look at history future, you will see more of this. So turn to, well, you know what? Yeah, let's do that. Matthew 19, the passage that was read for us. No, it's a different passage. We'll read 19, 1 through 3. Now it came to pass when Jesus had finished these sayings, we're coming close to the time when he would be crucified, that he departed from Galilee and came to the region of Judea beyond the Jordan, and great multitudes followed him there, and he healed them there. The Pharisees, these are the guys that want to kill him, also came to him, testing him and saying to him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason? What are the Pharisees seeking to do here? You see, by this time they wanted to find ground to kill him. That is man's general response to moral truth, exposure of moral truth, kill the messenger. So they tried to trap Jesus between Hillel and Shammai. And what was Jesus' answer? Though he did not say it like that, his answer was, Hillel is wrong and Shammai is wrong. They're both wrong. There is no ground for divorce. You see, the liberals allow divorce in almost any case, and the conservatives only in rare cases. And Jesus is saying, no, divorce is allowable. So the disciples clasped their hands over their mouths and said, Master, I'm putting it in my words now, Master, if that is the case, it is very unwise to ever marry. You can't get out. And you might wish to ponder Jesus' answer to that. And I think that when you think it through, and no divorce is permissible, and marriage is for life, only now is it safe to marry. When you have one excuse, it's no longer safe. Well, when we come to the New Testament, we have the liberal view of Hillel and the conservative view of Shammai, but the New Testament brought about a major change on the views of divorce and remarriage. We have seen the teachings of Christ and Paul already, but let me mention one more person in the New Testament worthy of consideration on this subject, and that is John the Baptist. John the Baptist was the forerunner of the Messiah. He came to prepare the way for Christ. I believe John the Baptist held to the same view as Jesus and Paul. So we go to Matthew 14 now. That's the passage that was read for us earlier. And we'll take time to read it once more, verses 1 through 12. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard the report about Jesus and said to his servants, "This is John the Baptist. He is risen from the dead, and therefore these powers are at work in him. For Herod had laid hold of John and bound him and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. Because John had said to him, 'It is not lawful for you to have her.' And although he wanted to put him to death, he feared the multitude because they counted him as a prophet. But when Herod's birthday was celebrated, the daughter of Herodias danced before them and pleased Herod. Therefore he promised with an oath to give her whatever she might ask. So she, having been prompted by her mother, said, 'Give me John the Baptist's head on a platter.'" Now you can figure out what kind of a woman we have here. And the king was sorry. Nevertheless, because of the oaths and because of those who sat with him, he commanded it to be given her. So he sent and had John beheaded in prison. And his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother. Then his disciples came and took away the body and buried it and went and told Jesus. Now, when you read something like this, you have to read it as if it's real. It's not a story. You have to picture a head cut off. It's on a plate. It's brought to a woman. This stuff really happened. Now, Herod had a long list of sins John could have picked on. He was a very immoral man. But if exposing someone's sins to them is dangerous, exposing sins of the nature John the Baptist pointed out is deadly, literally. Herod had great respect for John, but his divorced wife, who also was his brother Philip's wife, hated John, and she could outfox the fox. She got him. Now you put any modern preacher in John's place, and he would never start witnessing to such a lost man by pointing out to him his adulterous life. Am I right? You see, we would get such a man saved. Oh, you don't start there. That's the reason he's lost, part of the reason. And when they get saved, then they repent of that sin, and then they can continue living in the same sin. That's what we do today. Maybe we would try the seeker-friendly route. See if we could invite him for coffee and win him over, then get him saved, and then let him continue to live with this woman. Now you may say, just a minute. John said it was not lawful for him to have this woman, and maybe it's because she was Herod's brother's wife. They weren't supposed to have that either. Not because she was divorced. Well, if divorce ended a marriage, then she was no longer his brother's wife. No, the problem was Herod was living in adultery because Herodias was the wife of another. If John had viewed that physical immorality, as many view Matthew 5:32 and 19:9 was grounds for divorce, no doubt Herodias would have qualified. And John could have picked on other sins and maybe saved his own skin. Why did John point out Herod's adultery? Could it be here is his chief sin? And if he would deal with this, it would cause a major change in his life? So in short, as I see it, John, Jesus, and Paul held to a no-divorce view. Let's consider now the time after the New Testament was completed. We'll begin with the first 1,500 years, because after 1,500 years, a major change took place. We ask what has happened in church history on our subject. Well, here is what we can say. A major change took place in the church on the view of divorce and remarriage from the views held in Judaism. For some 1,500 years, the view of no divorce was maintained. 1,500 years. And I ask, why such a drastic change from the view of Judaism, Hillel and Shammai, to the view of the church? Why such a change? One reason and one alone. The view of Jesus and the view presented in the New Testament brought about this change. Interestingly, many believed divorce was acceptable, but not remarriage as long as the partner was alive. That view is still held by many people. You can divorce but not remarry. And I say, why divorce? That's separation. Except for today's laws that may become necessary. So I do not view separation as a divorce. A reunion after separation does not require a remarriage, but if it is called divorce, but separation is meant, I am okay with that. The early church in general held the view I have presented that Jesus and Paul taught. A new marriage could not be contracted unless the first spouse died. But not only did they hold to absolutely no divorce and remarriage, but numerous early church teachers held views so strict that they felt not even a widow or widower could remarry. For example, one article said this regarding Tertullian, around 200 years after Christ, that he, like his contemporaries, held that the marital bond is indissoluble. In his treatise on marriage and remarriage, he strongly objected to a woman's remarrying even after her husband's death, because she would then have one husband in the flesh and another in the spirit. That would be adultery, joint knowledge of one woman by two men. Well, we wouldn't, of course, agree with him, but they were stricter than we are in this church. Early church, some of them. And so, if anything, some of these early church preachers would have a more strict view than we do, and what we hold to is unacceptable to the vast majority of evangelicalism. Let me give a reduced version of David L. Snuth's article, Divorce and Remarriage from the Early Church to John Wesley. The story we're reading here is somewhere in Wesley's time for our children. This is from Winnipeg Theological Seminary of Otterburn, Manitoba, with regard to divorce and remarriage in the secular world in Christ's time, and that's why Mark's gospel is written the way it is. In Christ's time, all peoples in the Roman Empire, regardless of their religious affiliation, had the right to divorce their spouses. Marriage was considered a private contract, which, like all other contracts, might be dissolved. Divorce was easily attained, and because the state placed heavy financial burdens upon single people, remarriage was encouraged. The Shepherd of Hermes, written around 140 AD, says a husband with an adulterous wife must divorce her, but for the sake of her repentance, he must never remarry. If she repented, he must take her back. Athenagoras, about 170 AD, said, "For whoever puts away his wife, says he, meaning Jesus, and marries another, commits adultery." The article then said, "Indeed, the marriage bond for many of the ante-Nicene fathers was so indissoluble that it continued beyond the grave." Well, the early church fathers, by the way, they went astray on a lot of stuff. We can't take this just because this is the view they held. But the fact is that when Jesus came, it changed the view of the world on this. Tertullian, 200 AD, said, strongly objected to a woman's remarrying even after her husband's death, because she would then be one husband of the flesh and another in the spirit, and so on. Origen seems to not have been strict and confessed that some allowed for divorce. Around 300 AD, the Council of Elvira was held, and divorce was strongly opposed. We're talking about the 1,500 years from Christ till us, the 1,500-year mark. Women who divorced their husbands, as Roman law permitted, by the way, the Gospel of Mark deals with this, were to be excommunicated. If a woman divorced an unfaithful man, she was not to be allowed to have communion until her first husband died. In 314, the Council of Arles was convened and was more lenient. It dealt with a young Christian whose wife became an adulteress. I quote, its counsel was similar to that of Elvira, that it should refrain from marrying a second time as long as the adulterous wife lived. No mention was made, however, of excommunication should he remarry. I think that without doubt, the prevailing Christian view from the time of Christ until the beginning of the Roman Catholic Church was the no divorce view. Soon after the Roman ruler Constantine professed to become a Christian, Augustine of Hippo became a prominent Roman Catholic theologian. His influence is felt in the world today in both Catholicism and evangelicalism. But Augustine set the major trends for Roman Catholicism, and he was a staunch defender of no remarriage after the divorce. So Catholicism to this very day is stronger against divorce and remarriage than Protestantism has ever been. But Augustine's views prevailed until the 1500s and for Catholicism up until our very day. The present Roman Catholic Pope Francis is a liberal to the very core, and it may be he will change all this. So we will now consider, so what we've done, we've covered 1,500 years. Just to say this, no divorce. No divorce. The Old Testament ended with allowing it for all kinds of stuff. The church came back and said none. 1,500 years. So we will now consider from the 1500s until today. We know that the Protestant church of today is very weak on divorce and remarriage. Am I right? And we ask, what eroded the permanence view of marriage during this time? By the time we come to the early 1500s, the winds that brought the Reformation were blowing strongly. If the Reformation can be viewed as a big moment for true Christianity as far as justification by faith is concerned, from the standpoint of divorce and remarriage, it can be viewed as the great disaster. I believe E.S. Williams rightly calls the right to remarriage after divorce a Protestant doctrine. I think that while evangelicalism views the Protestant Reformation as the great moment for the church, Satan subtly implanted something that he knew in the end would destroy Protestantism. Today, Protestantism is by and large destroyed. Here's what he did, as I see it. He saw the growing unrest among many Catholics, and he saw that Catholicism's hold on mankind through the apostatized Roman Catholic Church would lose a large segment of mankind. He found a man, a Catholic, named Desiderius Erasmus. In this man, he found fertile soil to plant a seed of discontent with the marriage for life view of Catholicism. This seed would grow, and in the end, as I see it, would be the destruction of Protestantism as we see it today. Protestantism brought about denominationalism. And I do not know of a major denomination that is not liberalizing or has not long become totally liberal today. It's over. It is over. We need new churches ground up. That, of course, means divorce is not a problem to them. Satan coupled Erasmus' discontent with Roman Catholicism's strict view on divorce and remarriage with the dislike of the reformers like Martin Luther for Roman Catholicism. Using these two things, he weakened the stance on divorce and remarriage in Protestantism. And so in early Protestantism, he planted the seeds that would eventually bring about a Goliath, and this Goliath would threaten to destroy the church and more. Let me read to you from an article on Erasmus. Erasmus held traditional Christian marriage in low esteem. He had a dim view of the church's position on divorce. To see how this came about, we need to look into his early life. We're just before the Reformation here. Erasmus' childhood experiences provided ample motivation for him to compose his lenient views on divorce and remarriage. Erasmus was an illegitimate child. His father, Gerard, grew up in the Netherlands and was attracted to a physician's daughter named Margaret. Gerard did not live by Christian principles, and soon Margaret was pregnant. Gerard's parents and 9 brothers urged him to enter a monastery and become a monk. Instead, he fled to Rome, leaving Margaret behind, soon to give birth. Later, Gerard was falsely told by his parents that Margaret had died. In a siege of grief, he then entered the priesthood and took the vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience. Chastity meaning no marriage. Years later, he returned to Holland to discover that Margaret, his son, and his son Desiderius were really alive. She had refused to marry anyone but Gerard. However, he stayed loyal to his vows, prohibiting marriage. The 2 parents continued to give Desiderius their affections and focused on his education, end quote. Well, surprisingly, Desiderius, with that background, still became a Catholic priest. But he saw through a lot of false teaching in Catholicism, and the article I mentioned further said, Erasmus was an outspoken critic against the abuses of the Roman Catholic Church of his day, and there were lots. $2.50 for this sin, $5 for this sin, etc. However, his methods and motives were quite different from those of the great reformers who followed him. His sharp wit and cutting pen exposed the vices of the church and lashed out at the monks. One of his famous books was In Praise of Folly, which exposed the disorders, ignorance, impurity, and absurd conduct of church leaders. One of the most well-known characteristics of Erasmus, like Hillel of the Jews, is that he was a full-blown humanist. It is not necessarily wrong to be a humanist, but when humanism, which is a man-centered view of life, violates theism, a God-centered view of life, liberalism will always be the outcome. It will never change. And so it was with Erasmus. In light of his parents' experience in life, he was the forerunner of divorce and remarriage in Protestantism. He's the forerunner of it in our churches today. Well, he was born in 1466, died in 1533. Just as the changes that would bring about the Protestant Reformation was gaining strength. And when Martin Luther, men like him, came along, they had already been infected with the teaching of Erasmus. So when Luther finally rejected Catholicism and nailed his 95 Theses on the Roman Catholic Church door, he was also finished with Catholicism and with certain aspects of Catholicism view on marriage. And so when it came to divorce and remarriage, Luther and numerous other Protestants, that is those who protested against Catholicism, readily fell under the persuasion of Erasmus. These early reformers were ready to reject Catholicism's strong view on divorce and remarriage, not because they had carefully studied the Bible, but because of their opposition to Catholicism. Never a good reason to change your views. Because somebody does something wrong doesn't mean you should change your views on everything they have. Of Erasmus, Luther said, Erasmus knows well how to expose error, but he knows not how to teach truth. And he fell under it. He failed to teach the truth on divorce and remarriage, and Luther swallowed it. There are those who say Luther held a high view of marriage. That is not true. If simply for one fact. E.S. Williams writes of Luther, he acknowledged that before the Reformation, marriage was considered as being absolutely indissoluble and was regarded as a sacrament of the church. However, the Reformation had changed the feelings of the community upon the subject. Never a good reason to change stuff either. The opinion of the reformers was that there was nothing of a sacramental nature connected with marriage, which which they thought to be a mere civil contract, which ought to be dealt with in the same way as other civil contracts. Marriage is no different than buying a car. Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, right down the line. This is where we got it. We never got this view from the Bible. I continue reading. By considering what was in the best interest of the parties concerned, civil contracts, so on. You cannot take a high view of marriage, as Luther said, as they say Luther had, and say marriage is not in the realm of the sacred, but in the realm of the secular state. That is not possible. Roman Catholicism viewed marriage as a Christian sacrament. We may not agree with the word sacrament, but it is sacred. So what is a sacrament? Well, Augustine, that I talked about earlier, has well defined a sacrament in words we understand. He said it is an outward and visible sign of an inward and invisible grace. We might not call it an invisible grace, but an invisible bond. Webster's 1828 dictionary says the word sacrament has as its root the Latin word sacramentum, meaning an oath, which comes from the word sacra, or sacred. If the word sacrament is used to refer to marriage as a sacred event, I would agree with that. It is a divine bond, not a bond of the state. The state may have it. We see what the state does with it today. To downplay marriage as a responsibility of the state is not a high view of marriage. Marriage was never the idea of the state. It was God's idea, and it belongs solidly in the realm of the responsibility of God's people. The Christian should maintain this most sacred institution regardless of what the state does. Do you agree with that? The state doesn't determine what is sacred. So we might well ask, should the church set the standard for marriage or the secular world? Not even a question, is it? Not even a question. Why did the world ever have a high view of marriage? Because of the church. Why did the church drop their high view of marriage? Because of the world. Think that through. Well, what happened in the church after the Reformation? Denominationalism began. Many of the major denominations of today were begun shortly after the Reformation. That holds true for Mennonitism. I quote from E.S. Williams again, the Christian voice in the debate, that is divorce and remarriage, the Christian voice that we're talking in these 500 years was confused. This voice gave a confused message. The Bible said no, the Catholic said no, the Christian voice gave a confused message. I continue reading. While the Protestant Episcopal Church was conservative on the issue of divorce, most Protestants, such as the Methodists, Congregationalists, Presbyterians, Lutherans, and Baptists, accepted the Protestant doctrine that divorce was permitted for certain reasons. By the way, Baptists have had a very huge influence on this. Mennonites too, by the way. Shame on Mennonites. Shame on us. What happened in the church after the Reformation? Protestantism became the vehicle through which divorce and remarriage entered the church. Can you think of a more subtle Satan? Brought about the Reformation, snuck in divorce and remarriage through the Protestant church. Well, having seen what eroded the indissolubility of marriage in the last 500 years, we now ask what continued to preserve this view in the world. It has been preserved until maybe the 1950s or so, largely. Why did marriage remain such a strong force in the world after the Reformation? First, again, I think, is the teaching of Jesus and Paul in the New Testament. They are just very hard to change. You can say whatever you want about those words, but they stay there. It's written. We may redefine the words, explain them in different ways, but the words remain, and they remain to have an influence, and they will continue to do so. Anybody who reads the Bible will see it. Those who read the New Testament will always be confronted with this line. Those who are divorced and remarried, who are listening to me this morning, you know I'm telling you the truth. You are arguing all kinds of things, but you know you are not telling the truth. You know it. You see, you can't get away from it. It's in here. Second, without doubt, was the strong stance of Roman Catholicism. They have never flagged until today. Today, Pope Francis is making, I think, unparalleled changes. The Catholic Online said the other day that as it stands, priests that take a vow cannot be married, and divorced persons who remarry are committing adultery. But Pope Francis has said, and it may only be in private this far, that his priorities as Pope are to change the rules for the divorced couples and to allow priests to marry. Of celibacy, he said that it was archaic and not a doctrine of the church. Of divorce, nothing like that was mentioned. But if he succeeds, he will have done one of the best things and one of the worst. The third great influence against divorce and remarriage, in my view, was the English Parliament. Amazingly, long before Catholicism gained power, the gospel went to the British Isles. Wikipedia says that as early as 47 AD, the gospel arrived in England, in the British Isles. The New Testament had not even been completed yet. Already the gospel had gone there. There seems to be no sure way of determining when the Church of England began. Some say it was around 597 AD. The Church of England dates its history to 597 AD. Long and difficult were the relations between the Catholic Church and the church we now know as the Church of England, or Anglican. Henry VIII broke relationship with the Catholic Church because they did not allow him to get rid of his wife and marry another. He had a number of them later. So many Roman Catholics see 1534 as the beginning of the Church of England. Henry VIII also set himself up as the supreme head of the Church of England. This act made the secular state the head of the church. In Catholicism, the church had exercised authority over the state. Now the state is over the church. Both are wrong, by the way. So here we are at the same time as Erasmus' influence was felt by the world on this subject, and as the winds of change were blowing towards the Reformation, and with King Henry wanting divorce and separating from Catholicism, we now have a change, huge change coming. How did England remain such a strong force against divorce and remarriage with such things as Henry VIII? Well, after Henry VIII, the Queen, now known as Bloody Mary, put the church back under Catholic rule. When her half-sister Elizabeth came to the throne, she became a determined opponent to Roman Catholicism. When Pope Pius V excommunicated her, the break between Anglican and Roman Catholic Church became final, and once more the ruling king or queen became the head of the Church of England. And even today, Queen Elizabeth is the head of the Anglican Church, although, as in most all other things the Queen does, it's basically symbolical. So the Church of England did not separate between church and state, and thus, when divorce came up for discussion in England, it was dealt with in the political realm. Want to give some credit to politics? They stood stronger on divorce and remarriage than any evangelical church ever has. Read the old novels or romance stories from England. You'll find out what views they had on divorce and remarriage. I think it would be hard to argue that the view of the Roman Catholic Church continued to have great influence in the Church of England, and thus it maintained a strong stand on divorce and remarriage. And as I see it, the British Parliament stood stronger against divorce and remarriage than any other church ever has, with the exception of the Roman Catholic Church. But in English politics, year by year, liberal forces chipped away at the strong stance on divorce and remarriage. And in a meeting in 2002, not long ago, a General Synod meeting dealt with the issue once more, and the outcome was 269 votes against 83. It's like our liberal votes today. and they made the decision to allow for divorce. So the English were a great force in maintaining a strong stand on divorce and remarriage in the world. Those then I see as the major influences in the world in the last 500 years that have helped hold a conscience on this subject. And last, let me ask, what has happened in the United States of America and Canada? America, when was it discovered? 1492, just before the Reformation. By the early 1600s, the first settlers arrived. By now, denominationalism had formed in Europe, and many of them came to America. E.S. Williams, in his book, The Great Divorce Controversy, has a chapter on America. The first paragraph begins like this: America's road to mass divorce was very different from that chosen by England. While England accepted divorce reluctantly and only after a fierce struggle, the American people right from the beginning yearned after divorce. Whereas in England the debate revolved around the indissolubility of marriage, God-centered view, the American debate was more concerned with finding the right grounds for divorce, man-centered view. So it is no surprise, he's writing, that the divorce rate in the United States is the highest in the world, end quote. Let me say to that, the English had a theistic concern, the Americans have a humanistic concern. What was one of the main causes of such a move in America? It goes right back to Erasmus and Luther and other reformers. In England, until 1940 or so, divorce was almost non-existent. Listen, 1940, almost non-existent. That's not long ago. Why was divorce so low? Was it because there were no marriage problems? The Parliament said, you know what the Parliament said? They did better than the church. Right? They said, look at the countries that accept this. It always doesn't stay with one reason, it moves to two. And just look at it. And through that, they kept it for a long time. They said, are there not marriage problems? There are lots of marriage problems. If we allow it, there will be more. If we allow it, there will be more. The same is true today. So the divorce rate was low because of that. In America, by the late 1800s, divorce was beginning to climb. In the 1970s, it was already into mass divorce. What kept America quite low on divorce until, say, about 1940? We can say this: it was not due to the teaching and preaching of the church. Never has been in America. Few here and there. It was, I think, to a large degree, the influence of the Church of England, because there were many English in America from early years onward, and it was also due to the influence of the Roman Catholic Church. Sad to say, among so-called evangelical churches, there was very little influence to help stem the tide against divorce and remarriage. That's true today. Evangelical churches have been very influential in the skyrocketing of divorce, and that includes many Mennonite churches. Mennonites were on the forerunners of accepting homosexuality. Mennonites. Shame on us, Mennonites. I wonder how many of us are Christians. Today, Mennonites are as liberal as most liberals in almost every sense of the word. We still don't like going to war, but for all the wrong reasons. What about Canada? Let me read bits and pieces from the Canadian Encyclopedia. It says, traditional Christian concepts of marriage dominated Canadian society since the founding of the country. Since the end of the Second World War, however, the formal rules, family customs, and societal expectations around marriage and divorce have steadily been eroded and relaxed. And again, long before the founding of Canada, the Catholic and Protestant churches had established, they're not quite right here, but we'll see what they say later, had established that marriage was a lifelong exclusive union of one man and one woman who freely consented to join their lives for procreation and mutual comfort. Now listen to what Canadian historians say about Catholicism and Protestantism. However, the various Christian denominations, there's Protestantism, were divided on several issues. The Roman Catholic Church held marriage to be a sacrament, a sign of God's presence, while Protestants simply considered it blessed by God. Actually, they considered it a secular business. And again, I'm quoting Canadian Encyclopedia, Catholics believed that the marriage bond lasted until death, while Protestants accepted the possibility of divorce and remarriage in limited circumstances. Catholicism prohibited a broad range of unions among people, but offered some leeway in the enforcement of its rules. Protestantism imposed fewer restrictions on who a person could marry. Despite these differences, broad agreement on the fundamentals of Christian marriage existed in Western Europe after the Reformation. These beliefs and ideas were brought to Canada by European settlers and church leaders. And again, on another point, in the past, marriage in Canada was usually a religious rite. Civil marriage has always been possible, at least since the end of the French colonial era, but until recently it has been relatively uncommon. And then with regard to divorce, the history of divorce in Canada contrasts sharply with that of marriage. For while most Canadians married, divorce was extremely uncommon until after the Second World War. In fact, until that time, Canada had one of the lowest divorce rates in the Western world. Respectability, articulated by social and religious leaders, condemned divorce as a threat to the family, and the strength of this opinion prevented the relaxation of Canadian divorce laws. Consequently, access to divorce in Canada was extremely limited until 1968. And I do think that the Mennonites have contributed to some of that. And last, with regard to alternative unions, and I'm quoting again, in the 21st century, marriage in Canada no longer requires the union of a man and a woman. In 2003, some provinces began legalizing same-sex marriages, and in 2005, the Federal Civil Marriage Act made same-sex marriage legal across the country. Some religious denominations, however, continued to restrict church marriage ceremonies to opposite-sex couples. Some. Not a shame on a church. Note it says that it's some. This means most accepted the government's reforms, and that shows us the state of the church in Canada. And last, the other major change to marriage in Canada in recent decades has been the growing preference for couples not to formally marry, but to live in common law relationships. Canadian couples who live together for at least a year generally have the same legal and taxation rights and obligations as married couples. Listen, I want to tell you something. The most unbelieving of unbelievers in our country would like to have a good marriage, and they would like to be married. Do you know why people in our country are not marrying? They're afraid of divorce. They're afraid of divorce. They want a good marriage. It's not that they don't like marriage. You can study what the internet says. I think I got this next quote from the Berean Call, and they got it from world.com. Why aren't pro-family groups cheering the drop in divorce? And here are some excerpts they give. The marriage rate has been trending downward for decades. From 2004 to 2014, the U.S. marriage rate fell by 20%, a drop of 8.3 marriages per 1,000 unmarried women over age 15. The report also noted the divorce rate's steady decline since 1979. But those numbers do not tell the whole story, according to experts. The declining marriage rate is not so much a reflection that marriage is no longer desired. It is still desired. But that in a culture of distrust and divorce, it is fragile. I told you the only safe time to marry is when there's no divorce. Now that it is free divorce, they're scared to get married. The Amber and Lapp are the researchers for family studies and co-authors of the report's essay on marriage. The Lapps assert young people today are not opposed to marriage. They are conflicted about it. They are troubled. By whom? Their parents, the church. They want a healthy, sustaining marriage relationship and desire to raise their kids within marriage, but they are afraid of divorce. Well, that is a very brief 6,000-year history of divorce and remarriage, and almost no time spent on the Old and New Testaments, or the first 1,500 years of church history. We spent most on the last 500 years of the church age, and so this is an overview. The lessons to learn are that when divorce is allowed for one reason, it will never stay with that. Here's a reminder, if this church continues to exist, here's a reminder to you. It will eat and eat until you have a no-fault divorce rule. I think it must always harm the children's moral compass. And also, if one becomes humanistic in one's thinking, one is most likely to become liberal in morals. And humanism will always end up in allowing divorce and remarriage. When our view is a man-centered view, that's why we give in to divorce and remarriage. It is us, poor them. It's not God, not God. When our view centers around God, then only can we see marriage and divorce from the right perspective. I think theologians would not yet disagree with the first question of most catechism. What is the chief end of man? It's not man. It's God. The glory of God, not man's comfort. We have been created to exist for the glory of God, and He is the one who decides what will bring glory to Him. And when we do that, we find that what brings glory to Him is in the long run for the good of man. If we hold to a no divorce stand and stand strong, in the long run, that's what's for the good of society. The indissolubility view of marriage brings glory to God and in the long run preserves mankind. The view that divorce may be entered for one or more reasons is a destroyer of mankind. All you have to do is look at our own country or the church. And in the next message, I want to look briefly at the social factor in our subject. What does divorce do to society? And then someday we'll have a more pleasant subject.